Among the closest allies of the Western world, the strongest split in decades is brewing, and this is no longer a hidden crisis of trust, but an open transformation of the entire global architecture. Europe and the USA, despite decades of the closest cooperation, are experiencing a sharp cooling of relations after Donald Trump's return to the White House. The new package of tariffs aimed against European industry, primarily automotive, steel, chemical, and high-tech goods, has become a particularly painful blow for Brussels. For the EU, it was a shock. An ally that for decades was considered a guarantor of economic stability suddenly turned into a source of threat. And while in 2018 to 2020, Europe still tried to adapt to Trump's unpredictability, now Brussels' tone has become much tougher. According to such outlets as Financial Times, Handelsblatt, and Politico Europe, European leaders have concluded that relying solely on the USA in the new global reality is a strategic mistake. Inside the EU, calls for financial sovereignty are growing louder, and this concept is rapidly gaining political weight. Against the backdrop of escalating tariff wars, Europe has begun seriously studying mechanisms for diversifying its assets, from industrial supply chains to gold and foreign exchange reserves. And this is where the most interesting part begins. According to leaks from several European officials who spoke to journalists on condition of anonymity, as well as data from research centers Bruegel and the European Council on Foreign Relations, Brussels is holding closed consultations on the possible partial withdrawal of part of its gold reserves stored in the USA and relocating them to alternative sites. And what is especially surprising, one of these options is China. Yes, China, the main geopolitical rival of America, the country with which the USA has been locked in a prolonged trade and technological confrontation. This information is not yet officially confirmed, but the very fact that such discussions are taking place at this level indicates unprecedented changes. According to sources in the European Central Bank, the idea of placing part of the reserves in China emerged as a response to the growing unpredictability of Washington's policies and the risk that the American administration could use financial instruments as a means of political pressure. Of course, a decision to move tens of billions of euro in gold equivalent is not simply a logistical operation. It is an extremely complex legal, diplomatic, and even military process that requires security guarantees and political protection. Several European diplomats cited by Der Spiegel confirm that Europe has not made a final decision and is considering such a step as one possible tool of pressure on the Trump administration. Brussels is essentially telling Washington, if you continue striking our industries, we will begin redirecting our reserves and contacts toward alternative centers of power. At the same time, analysts at the London Bullion Market Association emphasize that dependence on China also carries risks. Beijing is rapidly strengthening its influence, actively buying gold on international markets and trying to turn the yuan into a global reserve currency. Transferring a pillar of monetary reserves to such a country is not just an economic move, but a geopolitical wager whose consequences the EU has not yet fully calculated. However, the very fact that Europeans have, for the first time in decades, started talking about withdrawing gold from the USA is already a blow to America's status as a global financial power. Over the past 20 years, not even Berlin, which traditionally stored a significant portion of its gold reserves in New York, had ever discussed such a move. But now, the situation is changing rapidly. Behind the scenes of the European Commission, scenarios are being discussed under which Europe may begin a gradual repatriation of gold and then distribute part of it among friendly and neutral countries. Germany has already publicly stated the need to increase the physical presence of reserves on European territory, and Italy and the Netherlands are considering creating joint storage facilities. Against this backdrop, the idea of placing part of the gold in China appears both provocative and strategically calculated, as it is a way to show Trump that Europe is ready to seek alternatives if the White House continues to act unilaterally. In parallel, a tariff war is erupting, which Trump has expanded to unprecedented levels. American duties now cover nearly all Chinese industry, from cheap goods to high-tech components. Beijing responded in kind, hitting key sectors of the U.S. economy, including agriculture and aviation. The economic duel has transformed into political confrontation and is now gradually spilling into the military sphere. The provocative maneuvers of Chinese destroyers are only the outward face of this struggle, while behind closed doors, Beijing is accelerating preparations for a possible operation against Taiwan. Satellites are detecting the redeployment of amphibious ships, landing drills, and construction of temporary infrastructure. And according to Japanese intelligence, China has for the first time in many years created a logistics chain that could support a major maritime operation in the strait for more than a month. Against this backdrop, Europe's strategy of gold diversification looks not simply like an attempt to escape American dependence, but like part of a global restructuring of the financial and political order. Europe understands that the old system is disappearing. The US is consumed by its own trade wars. China is striving for dominance in Asia, and the world economy is drifting ever faster toward multipolarity. And if Europe does not begin preparing now, it may soon find itself in a position with no viable options. Thus, discussions about relocating gold reserves are not merely an economic process, but a symbol of a global turning point in which Europe, for the first time in decades, is beginning to play an independent and autonomous role. And even if the gold does not ultimately end up in China, the very fact that this option is being seriously considered already indicates that the era of unconditional trust between the US and Europe is over, and that a new global financial landscape is forming right now. And it is precisely against this backdrop that anxiety is growing in Washington, as the Wall Street Journal reports that the Trump administration has held several closed-door meetings discussing how to prevent a potential outflow of European gold from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's vaults. Several officials told journalists on condition of anonymity that the White House is even considering drastic measures, including revising the rules for exporting the strategic reserves of allies if such actions are deemed to threaten US national security. But such steps have only heightened Europe's concern, as many European finance ministers interpreted these signals as confirmation that America may use its financial infrastructure as a unilateral tool of pressure. In Brussels, it is already being said openly that any attempt to restrict the withdrawal of gold would become a point of no return and would finally undermine trust in the US as a safe haven for global reserves. Against this backdrop, Beijing is deliberately playing on the contrast, offering Europe storage guarantees and full independence from American jurisdiction. Chinese media openly write that the world is entering an era in which the center of financial gravity is shifting eastward and that Europe must claim its place in the new architecture. For many European analysts, such statements are a subtle but effective diplomatic offensive aimed at showing Brussels that it no longer has just one strategic partner. For the first time in decades, Europe is facing a choice that simply did not exist before, and this is why discussions about gold are not about metal, but about the future of global power, currency alliances, and who will set the rules of the game in the 21st century.